A Ukrainian delegation has traveled to the United States for talks with Steve Witkoff amid a massive Russian attack on Kyiv. They will discuss the peace plan promoted by President Donald Trump. This was reported by Bloomberg, citing its own sources. In addition to Trump's special envoy, the Ukrainian delegation is also expected to meet with the U.S. President's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, in Florida. The Ukrainian delegation includes the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, and the First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Serhiy Kislitsia. Previously, the Ukrainian delegation was headed by Andriy Yermak. However, on November 28th, he resigned from his position as head of the president's office. At the same time, the agency specifies that it is Witkoff who is to lead the American delegation at the negotiations in Russia next week. According to a record reviewed by Bloomberg, a phone conversation between Witkoff and Putin's aide Yuri Ushakov, which took place last month, showed that Trump's special representative proposed that they work together on a plan for Ukraine, the publication notes. Meanwhile, Russia launched a massive shelling of Kyiv on the night of November 29th. Part of the city is without power. There are fatalities and many injured. In the Holosivsky, Solomiansky, and Darnitsky districts of the capital, fires broke out as a result of debris falling on non-residential buildings and open areas during the enemy attack. This was reported by Kyiv Mayor Vitaly Klitschko. According to him, due to the attack, some areas of the city are experiencing power outages. In the Darnitsky district, missile debris damaged 2 apartment buildings and fires broke out. In the Sviatoshinsky district of the capital, a drone hit a 3-story building, causing a fire in one of the apartments. A video of a Shahed strike on a private sector has also appeared online. In the Shevchenkivsky district, a 14-story residential building was damaged and apartments caught fire. As a result of the attack, more than 500,000 consumers in Kyiv, over 100,000 in the Kyiv region, and nearly 8,000 in the Kharkiv region have lost power, according to the Ministry of Energy. The enemy also attacked the Kyiv region. Apartment buildings were damaged. Fastiv was left completely without electricity.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has outlined the key objectives for the delegation at the negotiations in the United States.
Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, the head of the Ukrainian delegation, Rustem Umerov, along with his team, is already on the way to the United States. Today, Rustem gave a report, and the task is clear: to promptly and substantively prepare the definition of steps to end the war.
Meanwhile, the Wall Street Journal reports that the team of U.S. President Donald Trump is quietly promoting the idea of a peace plan for Ukraine based on a combination of diplomacy, negotiations over territories, and major economic incentives. According to the publication, Trump's real plan for peace in Ukraine is make money, not war. Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have repeatedly met with Putin's negotiator Kirill Dmitriev, who insisted that ending the war is possible through cooperation between the U.S. and Russia, with the restoration of the Russian economy involving America rather than Europe. American investors and Russian oligarchs were already preparing for a possible agreement. Political elements were also discussed: territorial proposals rejected by Ukraine, a large-scale prisoner exchange, and U.S. economic incentives for Kyiv. Donald Tusk summed up the situation succinctly: "We know this is not about peace, it's about business." The Telegraph reports that Trump allegedly instructed his special envoy Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner during their visit to Moscow to directly offer the Russian leader U.S. recognition of the Russian Federation's control over Crimea and other occupied territories of Ukraine as part of a peace agreement. However, the head of the Center for Military Legal Studies, Alexander Musienko, in turn emphasized Trump will not succeed in recognizing Russian control over the occupied territories.
He completely and utterly lacks the necessary tools and appropriate legal means to formally and properly document this on paper and subsequently give it any official, binding legal status whatsoever. This can only be recognized declaratively without granting it legal status.
Earlier, Donald Trump announced that his team would travel to the Russian Federation next week, where they will meet with dictator Putin.
Putin has made it clear that he is not ready to end the war in Ukraine, according to Western media reports. The dictator recently made a statement about the U.S. peace plan. At a press conference in Kyrgyzstan, he cast doubt on the efforts of the American administration, stating that the draft submitted by Washington is too early to be called an agreement.
But there were no draft agreements. There was a set of questions that were proposed for discussion and to be finalized. Overall, the Russian leader spoke not as someone seeking peace, but as someone who will not stop until he gets what he wants, writes Sky News. As an illustration, journalists cite the words of the Russian president with absurd demands for the withdrawal of the Ukrainian armed forces from Ukrainian territory. Ukrainian troops will withdraw from the territories they occupy. Only then will the fighting stop. If they don't withdraw, we will achieve this by military means.
As CNN emphasizes, with these words, Putin reiterated his maximalist demands, and now the chances for a breakthrough in the peace settlement seem minimal. The Russian president's comments indicate that he still adheres to the approach in which Moscow has repeatedly declared its readiness for negotiations but has not backed down from its tough demands, Financial Times emphasizes. Putin's statements have become the most convincing evidence that Russia is unwilling to take any action after American officials, including Trump himself, praised the tremendous progress made in their efforts to end the war, CNN adds. At the same time, during the press conference, Putin stated that the peace plan option agreed upon between the US and Ukraine in Geneva could serve as the basis for future agreements. He claimed that the US is taking the Kremlin's position into account. At the same time, he made it clear that he intends to continue dragging out the negotiations.
On November 29th, the Russian Shadow Fleet tanker Virat was damaged again in the Black Sea off the coast of Turkey. This was reported by the Turkish Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure. This is the second attack on vessels in a day. On October 28th, there were reports of a fire on the tankers Virat and Kairos, which also belong to Russia's Shadow Fleet. They were heading to the Russian port of Novorossiysk for loading. Regarding the Kairos tanker, the Turkish Ministry of Transport clarified that there was an explosion and a fire broke out on board. The incident occurred 28 nautical miles from the Turkish coast. According to the Turkish Ministry of Transport, the fire was allegedly caused by external impact. The Kairos tanker, which was sailing under the flag of Gambia, may have hit a mine. Another tanker, the Virat, was damaged by an explosion about 35 nautical miles from the Turkish coast, slightly to the east in the Black Sea. There is information suggesting that the vessels may have been attacked by maritime drones. Both tankers are on the list of vessels sanctioned against Russia, imposed after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation in 2022. The news agency Unian, citing its own sources, reports that the explosions on the two tankers of the Russian Federation's Shadow Fleet were a special operation by the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU. According to journalists, this was a joint operation of the 13th Main Directorate of Military Counterintelligence of the SBU and the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine. The upgraded Sea Baby maritime drones were successfully used against the vessels. Several media outlets report that both tankers suffered critical damage after being hit by the drones and have effectively been taken out of service, which delivers a significant blow to the transportation of Russian oil. Meanwhile, the marine terminal of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium in Novorossiysk halted oil shipments after an attack by unmanned boats on November 29th. It is reported that as a result of the strike, the remote mooring device SPM-2 sustained serious damage, making its operation now impossible.
According to the order issued by the captain of the Novorossiysk seaport, loading and other operations were suspended. Tankers have been moved outside the CPC water area.
The Caspian Pipeline Consortium brings together the largest energy companies from Russia, the US, Kazakhstan, and several Western European countries, and is one of the main export routes of the Russian Federation. In Russia, there were complaints about drone attacks in various regions on the night of November 30th.
There, an explosion. Did you see how it exploded? They're shooting over there. It exploded over there. In
particular, explosions were heard in Krasnodar Krai in Slavyansk on Kuban. It is reported that a local oil refinery was hit. The fire broke out there.
Anyway, bro, look.
The operational headquarters acknowledged the consequences of the attack. Although local residents see a glow and smoke, officials claim there is no fire.
The territory of the Slavyansk oil refinery, a gas pipe was damaged. No ignition.
The Slavyansk oil refinery is an enterprise that processes crude oil and condensate. Its annual processing volume exceeds 5 million tons. Air raid sirens sounded in Anapa, Novorossiysk, and other cities of the Russian Federation. People in the Rostov region couldn't sleep peacefully either. The governor of the region, Yuri Slyusar, stated that in Gukovo, allegedly due to an attack by unidentified drones, a boiler house that heats 128 apartment buildings and infrastructure facilities was damaged. The heat supply has been stopped. In Novoshakhtinsk, Slyusar complained about a fire covering 50 square meters at one of the industrial enterprises. Explosions were also heard in the temporarily occupied part of Donetsk region.
It fell, yes, I heard it. Over there, they're bombing the railway. They're bombing the tracks.
According to unconfirmed reports, railway junctions were attacked to complicate the logistics of the Russian Federation's army. Former Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine and Ukrainian Ambassador to the United Kingdom, Valerii Zaluzhny, stated that the most likely scenario for ending the Russian-Ukrainian war would be its freezing for several years, during which both sides would use the time to prepare for a new round of military confrontation. The former Commander-in-Chief emphasized that for peace to become possible, certain prerequisites must come together across the military, economic, and political fronts. In Zaluzhny's opinion, a collapse on any one of these fronts may only lead to the emergence of prerequisites for ending the war. The former commander-in-chief notes that the onset of peace will inevitably raise questions within Russian society about the number of human losses and their justification. Therefore, the Kremlin will not agree to peace without the complete defeat of Ukraine or significant concessions, the general believes.
War does not always end with the victory of one side and the defeat of the other. That was the case in World War II. But that's a rare exception because it has almost never happened in human history. The vast majority of wars end either in mutual defeat or with each side convinced it has won, or in other ways.
Meanwhile, Russian opposition political analyst Ivan Preobrazhensky emphasized that Russia will agree to negotiations only under three conditions. That is, when there is a combination of strong external pressure, military setbacks, and serious internal economic problems. Reuters reports that on November 30th in Florida, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Special Envoy Steve Witkoff, and U.S. President Donald Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner will meet with Ukrainian officials regarding a peace plan. Earlier, Zelensky approved the Ukrainian delegation, which will be headed by National Security and Defense Council Secretary Rustem Umerov.
Putin will allocate a record share of the budget since Soviet times to military purposes next year and for the next 3 years. The Kremlin intends to spend almost 30% or 13 trillion rubles on the army and weapons procurement. Another nearly 4 trillion rubles are earmarked for the national security category, which includes the budgets of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the National Guard, and the security services. In total, the security forces will receive almost 17 trillion rubles, which is nearly 40% of the Russian budget. According to the document, next year spending on the war will exceed the country's revenues. The Kremlin expects to collect 40 trillion rubles in taxes from its citizens. At the same time, expenditures will amount to 44 trillion. The resulting deficit will be about 2% of the country's total GDP.
They have already approved the planned budget for next year with a deficit of 3.8. This raises the question of how the financial state of the country is deteriorating, and most likely this target will not be met either. The deficit will be even larger. There is nowhere to get the money from. Right now, the price of oil is falling. Plus, there is the war with Ukraine. The Russian economy cannot withstand these two blows.
Oil and gas revenues, which have dropped by 20% this year, are not expected to grow significantly next year, according to economists' forecasts. And the Russian government intends to squeeze almost 3 trillion rubles in new taxes from the non-resource sector of the economy. To make ends meet, Putin is raising the VAT rate to 22% and launching a radical tax reform for small businesses, as a result of which hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs will lose the ability to use the simplified taxation system. A number of key social and medical programs will also be cut. The share of social spending in the Russian treasury will shrink to 25%, reaching its lowest level in 20 years. For example, funding for the Russian national project Long and Active Life will be cut by 26%. Spending on the program to modernize the primary healthcare sector will be slashed 2.5 times. The Emergency Medical Services Development Project will lose 28% of its funding, while programs to combat diabetes, cancer, and cardiovascular diseases will be cut by 13%, 3%, and 2.5% respectively.
Putin can't stop. Maybe he realizes it's a disaster, but he can't stop. He's afraid. It's a sign that he's been doing something wrong, but he can't admit it because then he'd lose his chances of keeping his position and his life. That's why he'll try to fight to the last drop of blood and the last ruble. The only question is that's not so far off.
Putin's growing war expenditures have even stirred pragmatic Europe into action. In response, the EU is rapidly building up its military strength and increasing defense spending. Germany leads in plans to increase its defense budget. Berlin is preparing to spend 25% more for these purposes. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Sweden, and Poland are not lagging behind either.
The European Union has also prepared a military mobility package, which will allow troops and equipment to be moved much more quickly if necessary. According to media reports, European countries will create a military Schengen. This project includes the creation of a pan-European military mobility area by 2027. In particular, the plan includes coordinating the use of trucks, railway platforms, ferries, and all transport routes capable of carrying tanks and artillery.